In 1622, a Portuguese governor sat waiting in his palace in Luanda. He had summoned the ambassador of the Ndongo Kingdom, expecting someone he could intimidate, someone he could control. Instead, she walked in. Not an ambassador, the Queen herself. Queen Nzinga of Ndongo, 1583 to 1663. And what happened next was the moment Africa's most fearless ruler announced herself to the world. To understand Queen Nzinga, you need to understand the world she was born into. The year was 1583. The kingdom of Ndongo, in what is now Angola, was one of the most powerful Bantu kingdoms in Central Africa. The Mbundu people had built a sophisticated society with armies, trade networks, and a royal court that commanded respect across the region. But the Portuguese had been creeping closer for decades. They wanted one thing: slaves. The transatlantic slave trade was growing, and Ndongo sat right in the middle of their hunting ground. Portugal was one of the largest slave trading nations in the world at this time. Nzinga was born into the royal family, daughter of King Kiluanji. She grew up watching her father fight the Portuguese. She learned strategy, she learned warfare, she learned negotiation, but she was a woman in a patrilineal society. The throne was never supposed to be hers. History had other plans. By 1621, Nzinga's brother Ngola Mbande had taken the throne, and he was losing. The Portuguese were advancing, villages were being raided, people were being enslaved by the thousands. Mbande was desperate for a peace deal. But there was a problem. The Portuguese didn't negotiate with Africans as equals. So he sent his sister. Nzinga arrived at the palace of Portuguese governor João Correia de Sousa in Luanda. She walked into a room designed to humiliate her. The governor sat in a large chair, elevated, dominant. For Nzinga, they had placed a floor mat. The message was clear: you will kneel before us. The Portuguese used seating arrangements to assert dominance over African rulers. Nzinga looked at the mat. She looked at her attendants. And she did something no one expected. She gestured to one of her servants, who immediately got down on all fours, and Nzinga sat on her servant's back, same height, eye level, equal. She refused to be made lesser. She then proceeded to negotiate one of the most favorable peace treaties any African ruler had extracted from the Portuguese, including the release of enslaved Ndongo prisoners and the removal of a Portuguese military fort from Ndongo territory. She hadn't fired a single arrow, and she'd already won. The peace treaty didn't hold. The Portuguese broke it, as they had broken every treaty before. And in 1624, her brother Ngola Mbande, broken by the pressure of war and possibly poisoned, died. Power passed to Nzinga. Now, this wasn't straightforward. Ndongo's system favored male rulers. Rivals challenged her. The Portuguese backed a rival king, a man named Hari Akiluanji, hoping to install a puppet on the throne they could control. But Nzinga had prepared for this moment her entire life. She is believed to have converted to Christianity during the 1622 negotiations, a strategic move to gain Portuguese legitimacy. She used every tool available: diplomacy, military force, alliance building. She forged a powerful partnership with the Imbangala, fierce warrior bands who operated outside any kingdom's control. Controversial? Yes. Effective? Absolutely. She wasn't playing by colonial rules, she was rewriting them. For the next 3 decades, Nzinga waged one of the most sustained anti-colonial resistance campaigns in African history. When the Portuguese pushed her out of Ndongo, she didn't flee. She moved east, conquered the kingdom of Matamba, and turned it into her new base of operations. Matamba, 1629, Nzinga establishes a new capital. From Matamba, she built a military machine. She trained soldiers, men and women. She is believed to have commanded female warriors within her armies, predating the famous Agoji of Dahomey by decades. She made alliances with the Dutch, who were rivals of the Portuguese in the region, and coordinated military campaigns across thousands of miles. In 1647, Dutch and Ndongo forces came within reach of retaking Luanda itself. The Portuguese were terrified. governor of Angola, described Nzinga as the most dangerous enemy of Portuguese rule in the region. Think about that. A woman in her 60s, because by now Nzinga was in her mid-60s, was the most feared military leader in Central Africa. She never stopped fighting, not in her 40s, not in her 50s, not in her 60s. In 1657, at nearly 75 years old, Nzinga negotiated a final peace, but on her terms. The Portuguese recognized her sovereignty over Matamba. They acknowledged her right to rule. They were no longer dictating to her, they were negotiating with her. She spent her final years rebuilding Matamba, welcoming back escaped and formerly enslaved people, rebuilding trade networks, restoring cultural practices the Portuguese had tried to erase. She died in 1663 at approximately 80 years old, still a queen, still undefeated. Queen Nzinga is just one of the extraordinary women whose stories we're telling in our Great Women in Africa series here on Throne of Empires. If this story moved you, share it, because most people have never heard her name, and that needs to change. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and drop a comment. Tell me, which part of Nzinga's story hit you hardest? I'll see you in the next one.